implications. And of course, we have not been able to uh, increase our revenue intake. In fact, it has been reduced very, very drastically. But we had started our human capital development program as a nation. My government is paying much more, uh, has put premium on human capital development, health, agriculture, and education. So without the requisite amount of money to actually continue this, it has affected us. But what we have tried to do is not to use COVID as an excuse. So in fact, instead of reducing our surge, moderating it, we have increased the number of kids going to school by 800,000. We continued all our schools, the exams we are taking, and we use radio and other media to reach out to kids all over the country. We think we could have done better had it not been for the coming of COVID. So I will say categorically that COVID definitely has had an impact, but we have refused to accept this, because there is always an excuse for not doing much. And I have to go back to my people. I have to make sure that we genuinely move, move the clock towards going to where we want to go.
Uh, Prime Minister Sanchez, in his UN Common Agenda, the Secretary General has called for a new social contract and on a local, national, and global level. What does that mean to you, and what would a new social contract look like for Spain?
Well, it means many things, no? I say that, for instance, this social contract will mean an international treaty of pandemics. I think that, as I said before, it is important to share knowledge, to share information, to put in common when we face and we need to respond to an unknown virus for the science. I think it's very important what Bio says about not using the pandemic as an excuse, but to accelerate many changes and transitions that we need to face, ecological transition, for instance, or the digital transformation, giving an integrative and inclusive perspective, not only a social inclusiveness, but also territorial inclusiveness, gender inclusiveness, and intergenerational perspective in order to create opportunities among our youth population. So just to mention one angle of your question, I would say it is important to take out some lessons. And one is that we need to strengthen our common response to future pandemics, for instance, with an international treaty of pandemics.
Winnie, you've been fighting inequality your whole life. Why is it so important to reduce inequality and exclusion? And why is it such a central issue for people in their everyday lives?
Thank you, Shaks, and it's an honor to be on this panel. You know, people have been losing power for a very long time. In the last decades, we've seen democracy lose ground. Inequality growing, extreme inequality growing to a point where it's now a global crisis. COVID-19 has exposed and worsened existing inequalities. But over the last 40 years, the truth is that a few people were making better and better for themselves at the cost of the rest of the world. To such an extent that in 2019, 26 billionaires owned more wealth than the bottom half of humanity, 3.9 billion other people. That is how bad the inequality was and continues to grow. So when power and wealth, political power and wealth, are concentrated in the hands of a few, that's a crisis of democracy. Public policies fail to meet the needs of ordinary people. that is the crisis we are in. So for me, extreme wealth is dangerous, and the idea of a renewed social contract is actually the idea of recalibrating, reducing those inequalities, and reducing and attacking the very structures in the economy that allowed this to happen. So what would we need to do? We would start now with the burning issues, and there are two for me that are burning today. One is the terrible inequality regarding access to the COVID-19 vaccines. President Sanchez has just mentioned 75% of the people in his country have been vaccinated. In my country, Uganda, it's about 1%. This is how bad the inequality is. And it isn't just bad for people who don't have it, it's bad for the whole world, because we know that more and more dangerous variants are being created when people are not vaccinated. Secondly, we know that the whole global economy is losing trillions of dollars. In fact, I have a figure that is so interesting, which is that the cost of vaccinating the whole world is 4 times less than what the world is losing by not vaccinating. So it doesn't make economic sense. So to me, dealing with that issue, that inequality, closing that gap, and secondly, closing the gap on taxation, until we also close the tax loopholes that deny countries the revenues they need to solve problems of health and education,
Yes.
we're still in trouble.
We're gonna be
So those are
looking-
the two.
Thank you, Winnie. We're
Yeah.
going to be looking at that tax issue actually in our second panel, and a little later on today on inequality to vaccine access is one of the issues we'll be addressing. Mark, you helped to devise the Millennium Development Goals while you were head of the UN Development Program. What do you make of the UN Common Agenda? Do you think it's achievable?
I think it's ambitious and absolutely necessary, which is to duck the answer whether it's achievable or not, because it needs to be done, and the world needs to show the kind of solidarity that our two leaders here have indicated they support. But this is a moment of a very fragmented United Nations, and I am one who thinks that the concept of a social contract could be the golden thread that sort of restores a sense of legitimacy and purpose to multilateralism. And therefore, I'm hugely in favor of the attempt. And I also noticed that in a way, the Secretary General implicitly is bypassing a lot of the existing structures of the UN with the proposal for a series of summits. Well, actually, what allowed us to do the MDGs was a series of summits which preceded it on social and education and the environment, the summits of the 90s. They laid the groundwork for the world to come together around the Millennium Development Goals. I mean, I'm always fond of saying, oh, we wrote them in a basement room in the UN and sprung them on a surprised world. But in truth, there was that sort of legitimacy building through summits. So, while summits in an era of COVID and limited travel seems a hugely complicated thing to do, jamming up New York with more limos for more time, whether it is virtual or real, the idea of getting world leaders together around these issues and driving agreement, outside the broken structures of the Security Council or the General Assembly, is ambitious, but very, very necessary.
Let's take a look now at some specific examples of action being taken to reduce inequality that are showing visible results in people's lives. Back to you, President Bio. According to the Pathfinders research, that report, for people in Sierra Leone, the COVID pandemic has been maybe a little less so about a health crisis and even more so an economic crisis. Sierra Leone, as you mentioned earlier, Sierra Leone unveiled a new direction development plan when the pandemic started. What does the plan do to reduce inequality and exclusion to make a real difference for people in Sierra Leone?
The medium-term national development plan that you're referring to is actually education for development. I believe that education is a great instrument, a navigating instrument that is a universal key. And we have realized that 3 out of 5 Sierra Leoneans cannot read or write, which means we are not ready for development of any sort. And in that statistics, you also realize that women we are not involved at all, but a very small group of them. So what we did was we launched a free quality education program under which every child born in Sierra Leone today has free access to preschool, primary, secondary, and for the girls, actually, they have 17 years of free tuition access because they can actually go to university if they are doing science, and it's the government that is paying for them. What we want to do is to close the gap. We realized that girls were lacking behind. After 6th grade, there was gender parity, but beyond that, only 1 out of 5 we go to university. So we are trying to bridge that gap. We have also done what we call radical inclusion. Girls were banned from going to school once they are pregnant. And I think that is secondary victimization because responsible people for the most time are responsible for the pregnancy. So what we have done is we have completely banned that also. And when girls, we help them not to be pregnant. We talk to them. My wife goes out, has a big national program called Hands Off Our Girls, which because of that we have brought in new an act of parliament which really makes sure that society recognizes the need for us to give chance to these girls to grow up and to nurture them. So in the radical inclusion, even kids who are disabled have free access. So only in Sierra Leone you have 17 years of free access to education for girls who are going to do sciences, and for the boys they have at least 12 years of free quality education.
Prime Minister Sanchez, I believe education was also another area that
Absolutely.
Spain has been looking at. I'm going to quote this statistic from the Public Library of Science Open Journal. It estimates that inequality in Spain in the pandemic would have risen by almost 30% in just 1 month without government intervention. So what action has your government been taking, and what else are you planning to do?
Well, we had a plan, first of all, resistance, then reactivation of our economy, and then, the transformation, the modernization of our economy. One of my biggest obsession is to explain to people that these twin revolutions, the ecological transition and the digital transformation, are a huge opportunity for prosperity, and not another excuse for, the exacerbation of inequalities in our country. That is why, for instance, regarding the ecological transition by 2022, we're expecting to close 85% of our coal capacity. What we are doing is to speak with stakeholders of the territory, with also the trade unions, the enterprises, in order to reach just transition agreements. And this is, creating a very positive synergies and dynamics in the territory. Also, what we did on the digital side, the digital transformation, is to launch public consultations with stakeholders in order to draw a kind of charter of digital rights. algorithms, non-discrimination, artificial intelligence. So the people see that this digital transformation is for good. So I think it's very important to, because in the end the private sector already is investing on the ecological transition and the digital transformation. What we have to do from our side, the political side, is to create a cohesive perspective of these two twin revolutions.
Winnie, you've said before, and I quote, inequality is not inevitable. Inequality is the result of public choices. If governments make different public choices, we can reduce extreme inequality. What we need is their commitment. Are President Bio and Prime Minister Sanchez demonstrating that kind of commitment?
Absolutely. And that's why they are part of this Pathfinders project. And that's why I'm also in it, because this is a group that is passionate and understands why inequality is dangerous for humanity and is determined to do something about it. You see, inequalities of power and wealth by the big pharma companies that now own this vaccine technology and the richest countries that have bought and are helping themselves, the inequalities between them and the rest of the world are behind this problem we have. Yet we know that unless we tackle them, we will not end the COVID pandemic and we will not get back to recovery as a whole world. The data point I wanted to share with you is this one, that it's estimated that getting vaccines to our failure to get vaccines to everyone in the world is costing the global economy $2.3 trillion. That is 33 times more than it would cost to vaccinate everyone.
That's a shocking statistic.
It just doesn't make economic sense. So the failure to ensure vaccination for everybody in the world, the consequences of new variants, of sinking economies in the developing countries, all of that high cost could be avoided by reducing that inequality of access to vaccines. So we've seen this before. 12 million lives in the South were lost when they could have been saved because they were antiretrovirals, but they were costing $10,000 per person. The technology was held by a few companies in the North. And until the world came together and we shifted to generics produced in the South, today it costs $75 a year. And everyone in different countries can have it priced differently depending on the income of the country. This is a story of success that could be repeated today if we tackle inequalities.
Mark, the pandemic does not look like it's going away anytime soon. Does the current crisis actually present an opportunity? Is there an increased will to try and affect change as the pandemic exacerbates these inequalities?
Well, Winnie and I debate this a lot between ourselves, and there should be an opportunity, because this is one of those moments of crisis where big pharma should be put in a half Nelson and its head put under a tap until it agrees to release drugs at marginal prices, or indeed to share, more importantly, the intellectual property rights. But this is very different moment to the moment when we faced a similar crisis over AIDS, when Kofi Annan was Secretary General and I was one of his lieutenants. Kofi, gentleman that he was, married to a Swede. They're why, so kind-hearted. But he did just that. He called in Big Pharma and he said, "We're going to waive trips. We will have generic producers making these drugs." Now, it's a bit more complicated this time because the drug technology really does need the cooperation of Big Pharma to make it. But there's just not nearly enough toughness. I heard Pfizer being congratulated by President Biden today for providing doses for the US to distribute. it's okay, but this is the weakest solution of all. We need to go so much further. And, I just feel the leadership there and the anger is not there. And, I have put together with fellow presidents of foundations, a grouping of foundations to press for jabs in arms and economic recovery over the next 12 months, because so many lives are at risk because of this. And I think one of the roles foundations need to play, and a human rights one like ours perhaps particularly, is to act as a foundation of conscience, to say to the world, for goodness sake, stand up and be counted on this and deliver. And to listen to those little girls struggling for a place in school in Sierra Leone, and to know that the world isn't standing by to make sure their teachers and parents are vaccinated so that the school system in Sierra Leone can work effectively. It's the great betrayal of conscience, the great betrayal of any prospective social contract of our generation.
Absolutely.
The Pathfinders report highlights vaccine equity as one of the key international policies that are critical to aid national action, to complement national action, access to finance as well. President Bio, Sierra Leone has managed to vaccinate just 0.5% of its population, according to the last figures that I checked. Maybe you have more latest figures. It's also had to borrow more to cope with the effects of the pandemic. How important are these two things for your country? Access to money and vaccines. Are you getting international help?
We are getting some help through the COVAX facility. We've had some vaccines from the US, France, China, but we have not even done up to uh, 1% of our population at the moment, and we are very eager to do that so that we can return to normality. But with the absence of that, and we know how important the vaccines are for us to really resume full economic activity, which should be our preoccupation. We are a government that is struggling. We have to make sure that we have to go again and borrow because our revenue is not performing. Activities have been slow, and of course, it has disrupted supply chains from around the world. So prices are almost doubling with deteriorating exchange rate in our country. It's even worse. We have struggled quite a lot with this explanation for the richer nations to understand the need for us to 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 put our debt aside for now, because, for instance, we use 70% of our monthly revenue coming in to just pay for the public service teachers and all the other things. The other 30%, 20% goes into just debt servicing. We are left with only 10% to fulfill our social pledges. It is extremely tight. The fiscal margin is so tight, we can hardly do anything to improve. But because we are committed, we have put aside 22% of our budget just to education, because we know that this is going to narrow the gap. We want to equip every child today in Sierra Leone with the navigational tools to be able to navigate the 21st century, especially with the looming fourth industrial revolution, which is going to require a totally new set of skills. So in terms of closing the gap, we don't want to use, we are not accepting anything. Even in the face of COVID, we are still committing 22% of our budget and making sure that it doesn't matter where you come from. The guards are giving more support today. We have introduced gender empowerment and equity policies just to make sure that the women are with this. We are even giving out loans, social safety loans to women, just so that when they can support the homes. And during the lockdown, we had few lockdowns of about 3 days. We identified the vulnerable groups, and we gave them food and money just to keep going. So these are the little things that can reduce the exclusion and also get everybody to know that they are part of the society.
Prime Minister Sanchez, how much can governments do alone, whether it's vaccines or economic recovery? How much international cooperation is needed?
Well, I think there are two examples. The first one, I think, is the common purchase of vaccines that the European Union made, not only to purchase those vaccines, but also to anticipate resources to the companies in order to speed up the process of investigation. And then redistribute it among our population proportionally to each member state. And the second one, well, my country, Spain, is the second largest car producer in the European Union. So now we are moving towards the electric car. And that is why, it is important to create this public and private partnership between the central government, regional governments, and also the car industry, the digital industry, and the renewable energy companies.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm going to jump in here because we're actually running out of time. It's gone very quickly. Mark, I needed to ask you about the summit that you mentioned just now, that global, I'm going to read this, COVID-19 summit, ending the pandemic and building back better, which was just held by the US. You attended this. What happened? Was it a success?
Well, look, I mean, it's fantastic that President Biden did it, and fantastic that so many leaders came, and the US now lifted its commitment to 1.1 billion doses. Chinese president, who very obviously didn't go, but nevertheless yesterday committed to 2 billion doses. So the numbers are starting to mount, but they're just still, despite the best efforts of everyone who spoke, which was an appropriate cross-section of civil society leaders, health leaders, as well as government leaders, there still isn't the plan to deliver this result against a deadline, properly resourced, and nor is there a plan to deal with the fact that this isn't just a public health crisis, it's a prospective looming economic crisis, a debt crisis in many developing countries, and certainly a sort of output and jobs crisis in many countries. And that sort of plan and collaboration is elusive. And we come back to the Secretary General's bravely proposed social contract. If ever there was a place for that contract to begin, it is in the ashes of today's crisis, to build back from this ruinous situation, which is more than a public health crisis. It's this breakdown of international collaboration and international fraternity and solidarity. So, let's hope and that what President Biden did today was his first small step towards a world coming together around this.
I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. I wish we could continue talking, but we have run out of time. Thank you so very much for sharing your ideas, experiences, and commitments. Today also marks the launch of the Pathfinder's flagship report. Here's a summary of that report.
During the first year of COVID-19, billionaires saw a 54% increase in wealth, equivalent to more than $4 trillion, whereas 120 million more people were pushed into extreme poverty, an unprecedented increase. There is no doubt inequalities are hampering the progress of humanity. So, is inequality here to stay? Not necessarily, but to address this, we need to fully understand it. Let's look at some data. 80% of the public we've surveyed feel there are divisions in society affecting the way we live together. The vast majority think these divisions create tensions, and countries are doing too little about it. Most people are bothered about the rich not paying enough tax, and the majority feel that governments are largely influenced by wealthy individuals, interest groups, or businesses, and people like them are not listened to. It can feel like change isn't possible, but some countries have been trying new things. In Sierra Leone, community justice organizations deployed paralegals in remote and marginalized communities to help support people resolve disputes, from debt to family problems. In the USA, extra welfare support for the poorest meant that poverty fell in record numbers during the pandemic. And in Costa Rica, a national conversation was launched to ensure even the most marginalized were heard. Across the world, policies are making a difference. And according to our research, the most important policies to deliver are those that create visible change, for instance, by increasing access to affordable housing, build solidarity between groups through social dialogue tools, secure credibility by addressing corruption so the rich no longer rig the system, and work internationally to provide debt relief to the poorest countries. Without tackling policies like these, we cannot fix other global problems, including the climate crisis. But our research shows we can start the process of healing, not only from the 2020 global pandemic, but decades of division and rampant inequality.
And there were some really shocking statistics in that video, and also some cause for hope. With us now are Sarah Cliff, who is New York University Center on International Cooperation's director, and also Dr. Faiza Shaheen, the lead author of that report. Thank you very much for joining us today. Sarah, if we could start with you, please. Why did you launch this initiative? Why this report, and what are you hoping to achieve with it?